Sure, Peter, let's go to my car, Scott said while sealing the folder and starting to step toward the front door. You aren't going to handcuff me or anything like that, are you, Scott? Peter asked. Scott shook his head and replied, No, we just need to get some formal information from you to follow up. The more background we have, the better chance we'll have at finding Sarah. I know, Scott. I'll help as much as I can. Thank you, Peter replied as he started toward the front door. Scott propped the door open and let Peter pass through first. Keith was on the porch waiting for the sheriff deputies to assist with the search. Keith nodded to Peter as he and Scott walked across the porch. It was still raining, so Scott and Peter walked quickly to Scott's car parked in the street. As they approached the car, Scott said, Sorry, Peter, but it's policy that only officers can ride in the front, so you will have to ride in the back. Sure, Scott, I understand, Peter replied as Scott opened the rear door and motioned for Peter to get inside. Peter got into the back seat, and Scott closed the door behind him. Scott then walked quickly to the driver's side and climbed inside. After starting the car up, he pulled away from the curb and drove toward the police station. Scott and Peter arrived at the brick police station in downtown Wharton. Scott pulled the police car into the small lot alongside the building and parked in a spot near the building. Scott shut off the car and got out and put his hat back on. He then opened the rear door to let Peter out of the car. Okay, Peter, you can get out now, Scott told Peter. Sure, Scott, Peter replied as he slid over to the edge of the seat to make his way out of the back seat. He then stood up. Where do you need me to go? Peter asked. Let's go around to the front door, Peter, Scott replied, while tilting his head to gesture toward the front of the building. They walked around to the front of the building. Scott opened the front door and held it for Peter. The two walked up to the front desk. The woman behind the counter could see the two of them. When Scott reached the counter, he said, Hi Rachel, I need to use one of the interview rooms with Peter here. Oh, and let Mark know I'll be with Peter Corbin in the room. Thanks. Sure, I'll let Mark know, Rachel said, smiling at the two of them. Scott led Peter to the left, past the front desk. They stopped in front of a door to their left with a translucent glass window in it. Scott reached in his pocket and said, Just a minute, let me get the door here. He removed a set of keys and sorted through them. After choosing one, he unlocked the door. He held it open for Peter and said, Okay, Peter, just have a seat in here. I'm going to see if I can find Mark, who is the chief. Oh, would you like some coffee? Thanks, Scott, black coffee will be fine, Peter replied, walking into the room and toward one of the 4 chairs around a rectangular table. Scott closed the door behind him, leaving Peter alone in the room. Peter took a seat in one of the chairs at the table. There was not much for him to look at in the room. Everything seemed barren. The lighting was a simple fluorescent fixture above him and the door had the only window. There was a large mirror on one wall. He realized this may be a two-way mirror, like he had seen in TV shows before. The walls were covered with acoustical tiles, probably so he could not hear what people were saying outside. After he had a chance to settle in a bit, he remembered why he was there. Where was Sarah? Was it possible that he did something to her while he was drunk during the night? He noticed that his head was hurting and his stomach was uneasy from the hangover, which was now beginning to hit him hard. He rubbed his forehead a few times with his eyes closed. Could the police think that he was guilty? What should he say to them, and maybe what should he not say to them? Peter took a deep breath and closed his eyes. The room was too quiet, he noticed. He could even hear his heartbeat, which seemed to be getting faster. Where did Scott go, and how long would he be waiting? He just wanted to get back home and continue to look for Sarah. He closed his eyes again and took another long deep breath. After slowly exhaling, he found himself calming down just a bit. He really could not solve anything in here alone. He knew he might just as well try to relax and wait for Scott to come back, maybe with Mark as well. Hopefully they would be able to help. He just stared at a tear in an acoustical tile. After several minutes had passed, Peter heard the doorknob. He stopped staring at the torn tile and focused on the door. The door opened, and he could see Scott and another uniformed officer. The two officers walked into the room and took the seats on the opposite side of the rectangular table. Scott sat to Peter's left, and the other officer, likely Mark, sat to his right. In addition to a cup of coffee, Scott had a notepad that he placed on the table in front of him. Scott then set the cup of coffee in front of Peter. After seated, Scott started by saying, Peter, this is Chief Mark Campbell. He'll be sitting in with me on this interview, if that is okay. Sure, that's fine with me. Hello, Chief Campbell, Peter replied. Officer Campbell nodded his head and replied, Peter. Mark took audible breath, and then asked Peter, you and your wife Sarah are new to town, correct? Yes, that's correct. We just moved here last week from Farmington, Peter replied. And where are you employed? Mark continued. I work as a realtor with WHN Realty. I work with Carl Bishop and Phyllis Carlton, Peter replied. Does Sarah have a job in town too? Mark asked. Yes, she works as a retail clerk at the clothing store on Main Street. I can't remember the name of the place right now. I've actually never been inside it yet, Peter replied. Mark was focused on the middle of the table for a moment, then looked at Peter. He asked, okay, next Peter, what we need from you is to basically retrace your steps from yesterday, to see if there is anything that will help us locate your wife Sarah. Fair enough, where would you like me to start? Peter asked. Let's start in the morning. Do you two get up at the same time? Mark asked. Peter could see that Scott was jotting down a few notes. Peter took a sip of coffee, then replied, well, we stagger it a bit, since we just have one shower. Sarah gets up first, and then I get up. She starts her job before I do. So whose car is in the driveway and whose is in the garage? Scott asked. Well, normally my car is in the garage, but since we went to the party last night, it's my car that's in the driveway and Sarah's car is in the garage, Peter replied. Scott continued to record notes on the pad. Did you eat breakfast together in the morning? Mark asked. Well, we did cross paths in the morning, as we usually do. She starts eating before I get downstairs after my shower, Peter replied. Was there anything out of the ordinary that morning? Mark asked. Peter shook his head and replied, no, not that I can think of. It was a usual morning, although we have really only been in the routine for the past week though. Oh yeah, did you talk to Sarah before that evening? Mark asked. Yes, we met for lunch at the Chiltern River Inn, Peter replied. Anything strange happen while you were at lunch? Mark asked. Peter paused and thought to himself for a moment. He then replied, well, nothing happened while we were at lunch, but we did talk on the way back from the restaurant. She surprised me a bit by saying she really didn't feel she was fitting in here. She felt like she wasn't fitting in. How so? Scott asked. Peter sighed and replied, well, you see, we moved here because I really wanted to live in a small town, since I grew up in one, you know. Sarah is used to bigger towns or cities. So living here is, well, different than she is used to. I don't know much more than that, since she just told me today. Was there anything else about that conversation that you remember? Mark asked. Peter thought for a moment and replied, no, other than that I tried to convince her to keep giving this town a try, since we have only been here a short time. She agreed, and then we both went back to work. Then you saw Sarah again last evening after work? Mark asked. Yes, she was there when I came home. She had been looking through things in the downstairs office in the house. You see, the previous owner left many of the furnishing in the house, including a desk full of papers. Sarah was just sorting through things again when I got home, Peter replied. You and Sarah went to a party then? Mark asked. Well, first we had a quick dinner and then we went to the party. It was at Carl Bishop's house. Again, he's the realtor I work with. He and his wife had invited Sarah and me over to meet some business associates and their spouses, Peter replied. He then took another sip of coffee. Mark whispered to Scott for a moment. Scott nodded, got up, and left the room. He shut the door behind him after he was out of the room. Mark said, "Pardon me, Peter. I'm just going to have Scott check something out." Mark continued, "Okay, Peter, according to Scott, it sounds like you had too much to drink at this party." "Well, yes sir, I did," Peter admits and adds, "I knew I had too much, so I let Sarah drive home." "That's smart at least." "Tell me about the party," Mark asked. Peter shut his eyes for a moment and rubbed his forehead. Afterward he explained, "Sorry, I'm still feeling the hangover pretty hard right now. Anyway, let's see, we got to the party at Carl's house around 6:45 or so. We had met some of the people before, but not their spouses. Carl introduced us to the guests, and then we mingled and obviously I drank a bit too." "Does anything happen at the party that stands out?" Mark asked. Peter sighed, shook his head, and replied, "Well, after a certain point my memory of the party is a little fuzzy. Nothing is coming to mind though. Nothing that I can remember being strange." "So you and Sarah left the party. Do you know approximately when you left?" Mark asked. "If I had to guess, I would have to say around midnight, but it's only a guess," Peter replied. "Then Sarah drove the two of you home?" Mark asked. "Yeah, we got home, parked in the driveway, and went to the back door, if I can remember correctly. She helped me upstairs, and also helped me into bed. My memory was flashing in and out. I remember seeing things just for a moment. I may have blacked out or something," Peter responded. "Okay, then tell me what you do remember after you were in bed last night," Mark asked. "Well, Sarah was in the bed originally. Then she must have needed to go to the bathroom, because I saw her go into the bathroom of our bedroom, you know. She did turn on the light and close the door. I think she may have been throwing up some in there," Peter replied. "You think she may have been sick?" Mark asked. "I guess so. As I told Scott, it doesn't take much alcohol to get her sick," Peter replied. "Is there anything after that you can remember?" Mark asked. I do remember hearing some noises, but I didn't look around to see what they were. Let's see, I think there may have been something like footsteps creaking on the floor. You know it is an old house and it is hard to sneak around in it," Peter replied. "Did you hear any other noises?" Mark asked. Peter sighed and said, "I think so. I vaguely remember something like a muffled thump or something strange like that. Though at that point I suppose it's possible I could have imagined it. I can guarantee it'll be quite a while before I drink again. My stomach still is in knots and my head aches." "Okay, Scott mentioned that you woke up on the floor in the foyer of your house, correct?" Mark asked. "Yes, I did. I have no idea how I got there or what I was doing. The last thing I remember was being in the bed and maybe hearing a few things," Peter responded. "You really do not remember anything about how you ended up on the floor, Peter?" Mark asked with slight sense of doubt. Peter shook his head and replied, "Honestly, I have no idea. If I had a clue, I would tell you." "Now, do you think that your wife could have any enemies?" Mark asked. Peter thought for a moment, and said, "No, she was well liked at her job in Farmington as far as I know, and she was out with co-workers from the new place she works just a few nights ago. We have not been here long enough to make enemies, have we? I just have to ask, Peter. Anything else that you think may be helpful?" Mark asked. "Well, Sarah had been hearing voices at night in the house. I really didn't hear much myself, but she is not the type to lie about that kind of thing. Oh, and she did say she found some information about the previous homeowner just before we left for the party," Peter answers. Do you think these voices could have anything to do with her disappearance? Mark asked. Peter was a bit stunned by the question, partially due to the word disappearance. It took him a few seconds before he can respond with, I'm not sure if it has anything to do with it. I just wanted to mention it. I have heard the house did have some people disappear from it in the past. What's the address for the house? Mark asked. 65 4th Street. I believe the previous owner was a Mildred Croft or something like that, Peter responded. Mark paused a moment to think. He then said, I do remember that name. You may be right about that. Mark said, well Peter, can you wait here a while longer? I need to go over some things with Scott for a bit. Peter sighed and said, yeah, I can stay. I do want to get home before too long and start looking for Sarah again. Thanks Peter, I'll try to keep this time short, Mark replied as he stood up from the chair. He pushed the chair under the table and then walked to the door. Before he reached the door, Mark turned around and asked, oh, are you feeling well enough to eat anything yet? Since it is close to lunchtime, I could see if I could get you something. Thanks for offering, but I have to pass. My stomach's just not ready for food yet. I'm not even sure the coffee will stay down, Peter replied. Okay, again, I'll be back in a few minutes, Mark commented. Mark opened the door and walked out into the hallway. He closed the door behind himself, leaving Peter alone again in the room. The room was quiet once again. The soundproofing must work, Peter thought, since he could hear very little of what was going on outside. With the silence, he began to think about his situation again. Where could Sarah be? Could her disappearance be related in any way to the previous ones? Hopefully the police would be able to help. He wondered how many people were looking for her. The police did mention getting the sheriff office involved, so at least it was more than just a few. Peter sighed again. He took another sip of the coffee, which was now about room temperature, but the caffeine would help the hangover a bit, he figured. He tilted his head back and closed his eyes. After what seemed like half an hour, the door opened again. Both Scott and Mark entered the room. They took the same seats as they did in the earlier session. Scott has his notepad with him again. Mark cleared his throat and told Peter, we contacted a few people who were at the party you attended last night. One person mentioned that you and Sarah got into an argument before you left. Do you remember this? Oh yeah, we did have a few words. I had been working with this appraiser, who is a single woman, last week, and she was at the party. I guess I had been talking with her at the party and Sarah apparently got a bit jealous about it. We worked things out though. I told Sarah I'll keep things professional with this woman, and that I would deal with her mostly by phone, rather than in person, Peter replied. Who is this appraiser? Mark asked. Colleen Phillips, Peter replied. Okay. Well Peter, I have to tell you that I'm not sure what's going on here, but I just get a feeling that there's something you are not telling us, Mark said. Peter was stunned for a moment. His mouth opened slightly. He noticed that Scott was looking away from him, and away from Mark. Peter asked, like what do you think I'm not telling you? I just have a feeling that you know something more about what happened after you went to bed, Mark said while Scott stared downward toward the table. Peter put his head down and moved his hand to his forehead. After sighing again and looking back up at the two officers, he replied, honestly, I'm telling you everything I remember from last night. If I knew more I would tell you. I was drunk. I just don't remember. The room was quiet for a moment. Peter then realized that he could be in trouble, so he said, well, I had no idea I would need to say this, but I think I would be better off with a lawyer now. Mark nodded his head and said, okay Peter, do you have one you can contact yet? Peter shook his head and said, no. Scott pipes up and asked, is there anyone in town you can ask for a recommendation? Mark turned to look towards Scott for a moment. Peter replied, I suppose if anyone knows it would be Carl. Can I try to contact Carl, please? Okay, Peter, go with Scott, and you can use the phone at his desk, Mark replied. They got up from their chairs and began walking toward the door. Mark opened the door and held it for Scott and Peter to exit the room. Scott pointed to a desk in the middle of the room and said, My desk is over here. You can sit in the chair behind the desk if you would like. Just dial a 9 to get an outside line. Thanks, Scott, Peter replied as he made his way to Scott's desk. The desk was fairly neat, but there were a few papers lying on top. Peter sat in the chair, and then he picked up the phone. He dialed Carl's home number first. The phone rang a few times. A woman answers the phone and said, Hello. Hello, Mary, this is Peter Corbin. I'm down at the police station now. Is Carl at home? Peter asked. Oh, Peter, we are so sorry to hear that Sarah is missing. Yes, Carl is here. He stayed home today to see if there is anything he could do to help you. Let me call him to the phone, just a minute, Mary offered. Thank you, Mary, Peter replied. He could hear a muffled call for Carl in the background followed by some footsteps. Someone picked up the phone and said, Hello, Peter, it is good to hear from you. We both feel so sorry for you. It was my fault about last night. I just kept pouring you more and more martinis. I just feel awful, Peter. Carl, you weren't forcing me to drink. I did that on my own. Anyway, I'm at the police station, and I don't really like how things are looking for me. Do you know a lawyer who could help me now? Peter asked. A lawyer, let's see. Oh, that would be Laura. Her name is Laura Monroe. She has been practicing law around here for at least 5 years now, Carl replied. Sarah seemed to be a bit upset with Colleen, especially since she was single. So it might be better if Laura were married, you know, Peter commented. Carl chuckled a bit and replied, Well, you can relax. Laura is married. Tell you what, I can take care of contacting her, and I can have her meet you at the police station, if that's okay with you? Carl asked. Sure, Carl, that should work. Thanks so much for your support, Peter replied. Oh, it's the least I can do for you, Peter. Please take at least a few days off, just keep in touch and let me know how I can help, Carl said. Well, if I figure out where to start looking for Sarah, I'll see if I can get people to help, Peter replied. I will be there for you, Peter. Also, I'll see if I can get others to help out as well. For now, I'll contact Laura and get her to meet you soon, Carl adds. Thanks again, Carl. Take care, Peter said. You take care too, Peter. Goodbye, Carl said. Goodbye, Carl, Peter said just before he hung up the phone. He remained at the desk. Scott noticed that Peter is off the phone, so he started walking toward his desk. When Scott reached the desk, he sat on the edge and asked, Were you able to find a lawyer, Peter? Yeah, my supervisor Carl is going to have one come over here to meet me. Thanks for letting me use your phone, Peter replied. No problem, Peter, Scott adds. Did you want me to move to another chair so you can use your desk? Peter asked. Well, that's up to you. I don't need it this minute anyway, Scott replied. Peter started to get up and offered, I'll just move somewhere else for now. I can just try one of the chairs in the walkway along the wall there. Sure, just let me know if you need anything, Peter, Scott commented. As Peter started to walk toward the chair, he turns back around and asked, Scott, do you think I'm telling the truth? Scott looked up from the desk chair he just sat in and replied, Well, legally I'm not sure how much I should say, but other than a few strange things you have described, it seems plausible so far. Peter nodded and replied, Thanks, Scott, that helps. Scott nodded in acknowledgement. Peter turned and continued walking toward the chair. He reached the chair and he took a seat. Peter closed his eyes and leaned his head against the wall. His head ached, and he was still in disbelief of everything that had happened. Peter remained in the seat for about another half an hour. His head was still leaning back against the wall behind the bench. In the background, Peter could occasionally hear the muffled sound of Rachel working dispatch. With his eyes still shut, he could hear the sound of someone entering through the front door. He brought his head forward and opened his eyes. A woman was walking up to the front desk. She removed her sunglasses as she reached the desk. Before she said anything, she made eye contact with Peter. He remembered that he was a new face around this town. The woman said something to Rachel and pointed back toward him. Rachel nodded and turned to look at him. The woman then made her way towards Peter. Peter stood up as the woman approached him. She extended her hand and said, "You must be Peter." "I'm Laura Monroe." Peter reached his hand to shake Laura's hand, and replied, "Yes, I'm Peter Corbin. Thanks so much for coming. I really didn't like where the questioning was going and I felt I needed to talk with a lawyer." "Well, that's why I'm here, Peter," Laura replied. Mark approached the two of them and said, "Hello, Laura. So you are going to be helping Peter?" "Yes, I am." "So is he done here, Mark?" she asked, looking directly at him. Mark paused for a moment and said, "Well, I suppose we don't have enough to charge him yet. We may have more questions for him, so don't let him go too far, okay? Guilty until proven innocent, huh?" Laura replied with a slight smirk. Mark sighed and then said, "He is free to go." "Thank you, Mark," she replied, while leading Peter toward the front desk. "I take it you were brought here from your house and you need a ride to home?" she asked Peter. "Yeah, I'll need a ride. Could you drop me off, please?" Peter asked. "Sure, I was planning on it. If you can spare some time when we get to your house, we can go over some of the details of this case," Laura offered as they made their way to the front door of the police station. "That should work. I can try to bring you up to speed with what I told the police. Maybe you can help figure out where my wife Sarah is, too," Peter replied as he held the door for Laura. Laura sighed and said, "Peter, I will do what I can, but finding a missing person is not my specialty." The two walked through the door and Peter replied, "Well, I think anything will help at this point." Laura pointed to the lot around the building and said, "My car is in the lot here. It's the blue sedan right there." They walked toward the car. Once both of them were in the car, she started it. "Okay, where do you live, Peter?" she asked. "Oh, the address is 65 4th Street. It shouldn't be too far," Peter replied. "No, it's not too far and I know about where it is," she replied as she put the car into gear and backed out of the parking space. They then drive toward Peter and Sarah's house. When they approached Peter and Sarah's house, they could see one sheriff car still in front of the house and yellow police tape surrounding the house. Peter let out an audible sigh when he saw the tape, since he was reminded that Sarah was still missing. Laura pulls the car along the curb in front of the house and the two of them get out of the car. Laura took a legal pad and pen with her from the car. As they made their way to the sidewalk toward the front walk, a uniformed man in a wide-brimmed hat begins walking from the front door toward them. The two duck under the yellow police tape and greet the uniformed man on the front walk. "Are you Peter Corbin, sir?" the uniformed man asked. "Yes, I'm Peter Corbin, and this is my attorney Laura Monroe," Peter replied. He said as he tipped his head downward to acknowledge Laura. "My name is Sheriff Gordon Hughes. I have been taking the lead of the search of your residence. The others have left and I'm just finishing up. Have you found Sarah or at least any clues as to where she could be?" Peter asked. Gordon replied, "Well, sorry to tell you that we have been unable to find anything that would lead us to locate your wife, Peter." "So you didn't find any clues or anything strange in the whole house?" Peter asked. "Let's see, we did investigate the spot in the foyer where you said you awoke this morning and the upstairs bathroom where you said that you last heard your wife. From that we did not find anything out of the ordinary.